The world thought it had chosen peace, but peace, built on punishment, cannot survive. World War II began the moment World War I ended. The First World War was meant to be the war that ended all wars. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world believed it stood at the edge of a new era, one shaped by diplomacy, cooperation, and lasting peace. Yet beneath the celebrations and treaties, something far more dangerous was taking shape. The peace that followed World War I was not a cure. It was a pause. And in that pause, the foundations of World War II were quietly, deliberately laid. The aftermath of World War I did not heal nations, it fractured them. Empires collapsed, borders were redrawn by distant powers, and millions were left struggling in economies shattered beyond repair. Instead of reconciliation, the victorious nations pursued punishment. Instead of stability, they imposed humiliation. Entire populations were forced to carry the blame for a conflict that had already devastated them. Resentment replaced relief, and anger replaced hope. The treaties meant to preserve peace instead created imbalance. Some nations emerged empowered, while others were stripped of land, resources, and dignity. Economic systems collapsed under impossible demands. Inflation erased life savings overnight. Veterans returned home not to honor, but to unemployment and despair. These conditions did not merely destabilize societies, they radicalized them. At the same time, the international system designed to prevent future wars lacked both authority and unity. Promises of collective security rang hollow when action was required. Fear of another conflict led leaders to hesitate, compromise, and look away even as warning signs became impossible to ignore. Aggression was tolerated in the name of peace. Expansion was excused as correction. Each concession weakened the fragile order further. What made World War II inevitable was not a single event, decision, or leader. It was a chain reaction set in motion years earlier by unresolved trauma, economic collapse, political extremism, and the failure to learn the true lessons of World War I. The world tried to move forward without confronting the consequences of how the First War ended, and history does not forgive such neglect. This story is not merely about battles and borders. It is about how fragile peace can be when built on injustice, how easily suffering can be transformed into fury, and how silence in the face of danger can be as destructive as violence itself. To understand why World War II could not be stopped, we must look not at its beginning but at the ending of the war before it. Because once the First War ended the wrong way, the second became only a matter of time. When the fighting stopped and the cannons finally fell silent, the world believed it had survived the worst catastrophe in human history. Cities lay in ruins. Entire generations were scarred, and millions of lives had been extinguished. But there was relief in the air. Relief that the nightmare was over. Relief that peace had finally arrived. Yet this peace was fragile, and more importantly, it was unfinished. What followed was not healing, but a dangerous illusion of resolution. The war had ended, but its consequences had not been faced. Instead of rebuilding trust between nations, the victors gathered to decide punishment. Borders were redrawn not by the will of the people who lived within them, but by pens moving across maps in distant rooms. Communities that had shared history, culture, and identity were suddenly divided, while rival groups were forced into the same political spaces. These decisions were made quickly, confidently, and with little regard for the tensions they created. The silence of the battlefield had been replaced by a quieter, more enduring conflict, one born of resentment. Economic devastation deepened the wounds. Industries had collapsed, trade networks were broken, and national debts reached levels that no economy could realistically sustain. Ordinary people paid the price. Inflation erased savings that had taken lifetimes to build. Food shortages became common. Unemployment spread like a disease, stripping families of stability and dignity. The promise that peace would bring prosperity faded almost immediately, replaced by bitterness and betrayal. For many, the war seemed not to have ended at all. It had simply changed form. Veterans returned home carrying memories they could not escape, only to find societies unable or unwilling to support them. Once praised as heroes, they now stood in breadlines, forgotten by the same systems that had demanded their sacrifice. Their anger did not disappear. It waited. Across cities and villages, conversations shifted from hope to blame. Who was responsible for this suffering? Who had stolen the future that peace was supposed to deliver? Meanwhile, the agreements meant to secure stability imposed crushing obligations on defeated nations. These terms did not encourage recovery. They ensured dependency and humiliation. National pride was systematically dismantled, and with it, faith in democratic solutions. When people lose belief in fairness, they begin searching for strength, and when stability feels impossible, radical ideas begin to sound reasonable. Fear of another war hung over every decision. Leaders spoke endlessly of peace, yet avoided confronting the damage beneath the surface. They mistook exhaustion for harmony, and silence for consent. The absence of gunfire was treated as success, even as societies quietly fractured. Each year that passed without true reconciliation allowed anger to harden into ideology and grievance into purpose. What emerged from this broken peace was not unity, but a world emotionally and economically primed for conflict. The First War had ended on paper, but in the minds of millions, it remained unresolved, waiting for a moment, a movement, or a spark to give it voice once again. That unresolved tension did not remain abstract for long. It took shape in policies, demands, and decisions that placed punishment above recovery and vengeance above balance. The architects of the post-war order believed that security could be enforced through severity, that by weakening the defeated beyond repair, future conflict could be prevented. What they failed to understand was that desperation is not a stabilizer. It is a catalyst. The economic terms imposed after the war were not designed to rebuild shattered nations, but to extract payment for suffering already endured. Reparations were calculated without regard for economic reality, demanding sums that exceeded productive capacity. To meet these obligations, governments printed money, borrowed recklessly, and drained the remaining industries. The result was economic collapse on a scale few had imagined possible. Currency lost its meaning. Wages became worthless within days. Markets turned chaotic, and trust in institutions evaporated. As economies failed, politics followed. Moderate voices, those calling for patience, cooperation, and reform, were drowned out by anger. Democracy, already fragile after years of war, struggled to survive under the weight of hunger and humiliation. People did not abandon democratic ideals because they were ignorant. They abandoned them because those ideals seemed powerless to protect them. When laws could not provide bread, and courts could not restore dignity, faith shifted toward anyone who promised strength and certainty. National humiliation became a daily reality. Symbols of former power were stripped away. Military restrictions were enforced publicly, reinforcing a sense of collective shame. History itself was rewritten through the language of blame, reducing complex global failures into accusations aimed at entire populations. Children grew up hearing not stories of responsibility shared, but of injustice imposed. Over time, grievance became identity. This environment proved fertile ground for extremism. Movements that once existed on the fringes now found eager audiences. They spoke in absolutes, offering simple explanations for suffering and clear targets for anger. They rejected compromise, dismissed diplomacy, and glorified action. Most dangerously, they promised restoration of pride, of strength, of control over a future that had been taken away. In societies where humiliation had become normal, these promises carried immense power. The inevitability of a second global conflict wasn't sealed by a single act of aggression. It was the slow, creeping consequence of a peace built on a flawed foundation. The First World War ended with a promise to create a safer world, a vow that such devastation would never happen again. Yet, This noble promise was undermined from the start by choices rooted in fear and retribution, not in genuine understanding. Peace was treated like a final verdict, handed down to the defeated, rather than a collaborative process of healing and rebuilding. And in this environment, justice was overshadowed by punishment. The world mistook the quiet that followed for stability, and it mistook enforced restraint for true resolution. But silence is not peace. Beneath the surface, the collapse was gradual, but relentless. The economic despair that swept across nations weakened the very fabric of societies. Humiliation, felt deeply by those blamed for the war, corroded any remaining trust in international institutions. And into the vacuum left by broken promises and shattered economies, political extremism surged, offering simple answers and a target for the public's anger. The victors, haunted by their own losses, tried to preserve the peace through avoidance, hoping that if they just didn't look too closely, the problems would resolve themselves. But this strategy only deepened the imbalance of power. Every ignored warning, every delayed response, only allowed the unresolved grievances to fester, grow stronger, and become more organized. The international community watched as this transformation unfolded, paralyzed by an uneasy mix of anxiety and inaction. The same fear of another devastating war that had shaped the post-war treaties now prevented any meaningful response. It was a terrible irony. The fear of war was making another war more likely. Warning signs were rationalized away. Clear violations of agreements were minimized, dismissed as minor issues. Aggressive, nationalistic rhetoric was explained away as mere posturing for a domestic audience. Each act of leniency, each moment of appeasement, was intended to preserve peace, but instead, it sent a clear message to those who wished to challenge the world order. The rules could be broken without consequence. Soon, the economic instability that began in the defeated nations bled across borders. Global trade collapsed, markets faltered, and unemployment became a worldwide plague. The crisis was no longer isolated to a few countries. It was systemic, a sickness in the global body. But instead of inspiring cooperation, scarcity did what it always does. It intensified competition. Nations turned inward, raising walls and protecting their own interests at the expense of everyone else. Collective responsibility was abandoned. With every unilateral decision, every selfish act, the fragile framework of international peace grew weaker. What made this period so dangerous wasn't just the widespread suffering. It was the terrible lesson it taught an entire generation. It taught them that cooperation led to loss. It taught them that showing restraint only invited exploitation from others. It taught them that obeying international rules resulted in national humiliation. In the shadow of these lessons, the promise of force, of taking what you wanted, became intensely attractive. The world had tried to enforce peace through pressure, through sanctions and harsh terms, but it discovered a hard truth. Pressure doesn't erase anger. It just shapes it, sharpens it, and eventually gives it a direction to lash out. And that outward direction didn't announce itself with a single, dramatic explosion or a formal declaration of war. It unfolded gradually, masked by diplomatic language and public reassurances of peaceful intent. The world had learned to fear war so deeply that it mistook caution for wisdom and inaction for strategy. Leaders would speak of stability while actively accepting instability as the necessary price to avoid confrontation. Every compromise was framed as a temporary measure, and every concession was justified as a painful but necessary step to preserve the fragile peace. But peace was no longer being protected. It was simply being postponed. International agreements and institutions like the League of Nations existed on paper, but they lacked the power to enforce their own principles. The concept of collective security depended entirely on collective courage, and that courage was in desperately short supply. Leaders in every nation weighed their potential responses against the haunting memory of the First War's trenches, the poison gas, the lines of mass graves. The cost of taking action seemed unbearable, so inaction became the default policy. Violations of treaties were met with formal diplomatic protests instead of real consequences. Territorial expansion was described as a correction of past injustices. Rapid militarization was excused as a matter of internal reform. With each aggressive step forward, those who feared escalation took a step back. Public opinion played a critical role in this paralysis. Populations that were exhausted by loss and economic hardship demanded peace at almost any cost. Politicians, their careers dependent on public support, listened closely. They knew that taking decisive action against an aggressor could ignite unrest at home and potentially cost them their jobs. Warnings from clear-eyed diplomats, military analysts, and observers were softened before they reached the public, stripped of their urgency to avoid causing panic. The result was a carefully maintained illusion of control, a collective denial, even as the very foundations of world order were cracking beneath their feet. Mishandled, the ideological forces that had been unleashed by economic despair and national humiliation continued to gain strength. They learned to expertly exploit the hesitation of other nations. They tested the limits, step by step, and carefully observed the reactions. Each unanswered challenge, each line crossed without a response, reinforced their belief that meaningful resistance was unlikely. What began as simple defiance soon evolved into a calculated strategy. Borders were probed, treaty restrictions were openly ignored, and long-standing alliances were questioned and undermined. The absence of immediate consequences wasn't interpreted as mercy. It was seen as weakness. Technology and industry, once celebrated as symbols of human progress, were quietly factories that should have been producing consumer goods to fuel economic recovery were secretly shifted toward military preparation. Armies expanded, navies were built, and air forces grew, all behind a thin veil of legality and technical loopholes. Government surveillance of citizens increased. Propaganda was refined into a powerful weapon, shaping narratives that framed expansion as self-defense and naked aggression as a national necessity. By the time the sheer scale of these changes became undeniable, they were already too deeply embedded to be easily reversed. The global economic crises further complicated any potential response. The Great Depression had left many nations dependent on fragile trade relationships. To confront an aggressor risked severing those ties and plunging their own economies back into chaos. And so, economic stability was prioritized over moral principle. Meaningful sanctions were avoided, embargoes were softened, and enforcement of treaties was endlessly delayed. Every delay, of course, strengthened the hand of those willing to act without restraint, while further weakening those who were committed to following procedure and international law. Diplomacy, once a tool for resolving conflict, became a method of avoiding it. Conferences were held, grand statements were issued, and hollow promises were exchanged. Yet none of these efforts addressed the underlying imbalance and the unresolved grievances that were driving the world toward a cliff. The same resentments from the end of the First War continued to fuel the actions of nations. Instead of correcting those fundamental flaws, the international community simply tried to manage their consequences, hoping against hope that time would soften the anger and that prosperity would somehow return on its own. But time did not heal. It hardened positions, it deepened resentments. An entire generation of children raised amid economic collapse, and national humiliation became adults shaped by it. They didn't remember the First World War as a tragedy to be avoided at all costs. For them, it was an injustice to be avenged. Personal memory transformed into a national narrative, and that narrative became a sacred mission. The longer the world waited, the more inevitable the confrontation became. The warnings were everywhere, for anyone willing to see them. Rapid rearmament, increasingly bold and aggressive rhetoric. Strategic alliances being formed in open defiance of the existing world order. Yet each of these warnings was treated as an isolated incident, not as part of a clear and terrifying pattern. The failure wasn't one of ignorance, it was a failure of belief. The world simply could not bring itself to accept but the very conditions it had created. After the first war had made a second one unavoidable. To acknowledge that truth would have meant admitting that the peace itself was flawed, that their great effort to end all wars had been a catastrophic failure. So when the final steps toward conflict were taken, they no longer shocked anyone. They merely confirmed what had been building, step by step, for years. The institutions meant to prevent war proved utterly incapable of stopping it. Not because they were badly designed, but because they had been systematically weakened by fear, denial, and a desperate, false optimism. What followed was not the sudden collapse of peace, but the delayed consequence of choices made long before. By the time violence erupted openly, the moment to prevent it had already passed. Years earlier, the path to war had been cleared by a broken peace, hardened by punishment, and left unguarded by hesitation. The world did not stumble into war by accident. It arrived there through a series of conscious decisions, all driven by fear, denial, and the profound unwillingness to confront the truth when it still mattered. The Second World War did not begin in 1939. It began the moment the first one ended, without ever being truly resolved. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective on history valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. See you next time.